This video will contain spoilers for the first 15 minutes of Silksong. Please do not comment anything down below that is not shown in the video. Thank you for helping keep this channel completely spoiler-free. The second video I ever made on Hollow Knight was a discussion of how well False Knight does as a first boss. Not only do I now get to do that very same thing for the first boss of Silksong, I have the privilege of being able to compare the two, to see which one may claim the title of the superior introductory encounter. Before I say anything else, I should tell you that I'm looking at both of these games as if they were a player's first time experience with the Hollow Knight franchise. Many of you will suggest, jokingly or not, that Hollow Knight is the tutorial of Silksong. And while that's certainly true for many players, including myself, I don't think there's much point in comparing the first boss of each game if we don't act as if the player hasn't played the other game prior. I think Silksong is designed for both new and returning players, and this analysis will primarily focus on the new players. Let's begin. First and foremost, it's crucial to note that there are significant differences between how each game presents its first boss and to outline the most important of these. Perhaps the biggest difference is how late into the game you encounter each boss. For all intents and purposes, King's Pass serves the same role in Hollow Knight that Moss Grotto does in Silksong. It's the tutorial you must pass through before either descending down the well or up the rope, at which point the game properly begins. However, once you reach this point in Hollow Knight, you've yet to face any sort of boss encounter, while in Silksong, you've already defeated the Moss Mother. Fighting and defeating the Moss Mother concludes Silksong's proper tutorial, while you can spend an hour of wandering around the crossroads before you ever run into False Knight. That's a huge difference in design, and it has a few major consequences. Now, perhaps surprisingly, I think each boss placement has enough pros and cons to make pointing out a clear winner difficult. Moss Mother comes very early, no more than 15 or 20 minutes after you've started playing. It's also, so far as I know, a mandatory boss, whereas False Knight can be partially skipped by breaking out of his arena. The nice thing about putting Moss Mother early is that it helps immediately set an expectation for how good you have to be at the game to enjoy it. Now, Moss Mother isn't a very difficult boss if you've played Hollow Knight before, but neither is False Knight, and I think it's important to remember just how much harder these bosses were when we first fought them. They aren't meant to be permanent roadblocks, but they do give you a taste of how difficult future challenges will be, and how much raw skill and perseverance is expected from you. As such, in terms of giving the player a reality check, I think the placement of Moss Mother very early on in the tutorial is good design. However, False Knight has his own benefits. Because of how much more you've necessarily been through before reaching False Knight, many different enemy types, a mandatory battle arena, and deadly parkour, you've likely developed a better sense for the controls by the time you reach the first boss. Heck, False Knight might not even be your first boss, given just how easy it is to stumble upon Grossmother. However, since she's arguably closer to a mini-boss in terms of difficulty and complexity, I still consider False Knight to be the game's first proper boss. Regardless, Hollow Knight really tries to set you up for the fight against False Knight. And while that doesn't mean you won't die a few times before eventually overcoming him, it does mean that you're likely better at the game than you are when reaching Moss Mother. Not only are you better at the controls, you might even be better at fighting the boss himself before ever meeting him. But how can that be? Well, these stalactites have taught you that dangerous objects may fall from the ceiling. The leaping husk has taught you that enemies may jump as part of their attack. And the husk guard has taught you both that some enemies use charged weapon swings to attack you, and that some attacks may produce shockwaves which should be jumped over. You may not even have thought about some of these as teaching elements, but I'm not sure that matters. I think what matters is that you were being implicitly taught along the way. No text box, no dialogue, just tiny drops of knowledge that you start to embody way before facing False Knight. So how does the Moss Mother contend with this ingeniously designed learning curve? Well, sadly, she doesn't really. And whether that's to do with the short length of the tutorial or there's another reason, I do believe it takes away slightly from a player's first experience with the game. Prior to fighting the Moss Mother, you're guaranteed to have encountered at least 3 enemies: the Moss Grub, the Moss Mere, and the Mauling. Now, what do these enemies teach you about the Moss Mother? The Moss Grub is a summoned enemy during the fight, but apart from teaching you how to fight itself, which isn't a very deep lesson, it doesn't relate to any of Moss Mother's attacks. The Moss Mere is a flying enemy like the Moss Mother, but it behaves very differently. The most I think you can say is that it warns you of danger from above, but even that's a stretch, given how you can bait the Moss Mere while the falling objects that Moss Mother summons are random. And finally, the Mauling. What does the Mauling teach you that's relevant to Moss Mother? I don't know, maybe nothing. Now, perhaps I'm missing a few key elements of the tutorial that serve the purpose of teaching you how to fight the boss. If I am, feel free to let me know in the comments, but as far as I can tell, Hollow Knight simply prepares you better for the fight against False Knight than Silksong does for Moss Mother. So in short, Moss Mother comes earlier, which is good for setting expectations, while False Knight does a better job of easing you into the boss combat. Now again, none of this really matters for someone who has already played Hollow Knight. All I really needed was to get comfortable with the down slash and the ledge grab, and I was pretty much good to go. But I'm trying to look at both games from the perspective of a new player, so again, keep that in mind. Now that I believe we've touched upon the most important contextual aspects that separate the two encounters, let's start to zoom in on the bosses themselves. For the sake of it, we'll make it a fun little point scoring match. From the very beginning, False Knight scores a point for not freezing the player in place upon arrival. Now, this is certainly more of a criticism aimed at satisfying returning players, and although I do want to put the beginner first, having an early boss be as adaptable to any skill level as possible is a hugely important quality in my book. So I certainly prefer the fact that you can start engaging with False Knight as soon as he enters the arena. And I don't see much of a problem with simply transferring this design element to the Moss Mother. Then False Knight immediately receives another point for not being a flying boss. Flying enemies in Hollow Knight are rarely touted as the most fun kind of enemies, and for good reasons, which I shall not get into here in great detail. Suffice it to say, flying enemies tend to be more frustrating than those who stay grounded and don't constantly shuffle around. It should be noted, however, that Moss Mother is significantly less frustrating than a boss like the Vengefly King, either due to enhanced AI or simply a more enclosed arena. One of False Knight's unique traits is that he does not provide any soul when hit. Apologists of this design point out that it's likely a measure to avoid giving the player the option to tank the boss and heal up after every hit. Meanwhile, critics warn of giving the introductory boss any trait that can be characterized as unique, since this sort of goes against the idea of the boss teaching you how such fights generally unfold. While I can certainly see the argument for both sides, I have not found myself lamenting the fact that Moss Mother does provide silk when hit, and therefore it teaches you that healing during combat is generally a viable option. Another unique characteristic of False Knight is his stagger. After suffering enough blows, he will fall to the ground temporarily paralyzed, not unlike many other bosses. However, for some reason, the properties of this stagger are quite unique. Firstly, False Knight always staggers a total of 3 times before he is defeated, whereas other bosses do not have a set stagger amount. And secondly, it is crucial that you hit False Knight during his stagger, otherwise he will not take any permanent damage. Again, this is not how regular staggers function, and it's teaching the player that healing through an entire stagger is a bad idea, even if that's not generally true. In great contrast to this, Moss Mother not only avoids having a unique stagger, she sets the predicate for future staggers by employing a very specific visual tell to indicate her incapacitated state. A white cartoonish circle swiveling around her head until the stagger ends. To me, this is undoubtedly an improvement in design. And now for the final point, the tiebreaker. It goes to False Knight. And it's because of one relatively minor design choice that a lot of players don't even know about, the fact that you can hit the infected barrels back into False Knight, damaging him. It baffles me that this is not possible with the rocks that fall during the fight with Moss Mother. This feature was such a clever way to allow constant engagement with the boss, and there was every reason to transfer it over to Silksong. But alas, this final point must go to False Knight. About 3 months ago, I released this video talking about the evil theory of boss design. Now, I will leave a link to the video down below, but watching it is not necessary to understanding this section. In short, the evil scale attempts to outline every major gameplay sin that a boss can commit. The scale was designed to be used for Hollow Knight, but it likely applies to similar games like Cuphead and certainly to Silksong. Here is False Knight's evil card. At the bottom, his scores on each of the 4 aspects of evil, rated from 0 to 3. At the top, his accumulated evil score, depicting his overall level of evil. A low score on any of these metrics is preferable to a high score, since a high score indicates a greater level of evil. Now, looking at these scores, False Knight actually does very well. Starting from the top, he scores a 1 out of 3 in erratic outcomes, indicating that luck does not play a major role in the outcome of the fight. The most prevalent source of randomness in the fight are the infected barrels, which, depending on whether you know how to use them offensively, you want to fall as far away from you or as close to you as possible. The only other significant source of luck comes from the specific attack False Knight chooses to perform, with the jump slam always being more difficult to dodge than the jump, for example. As for vague mechanics, False Knight scores a perfect 0 out of 3. Given that you're not pogoing him and suddenly getting hit by his giant body, I think you could have hardly made a more transparent boss. Very good stuff. Without being able to hit the barrels back at False Knight, his rage might have caused him to score higher on inactive gameplay. But as it stands, all that's really stopping you from wailing at him constantly is his prolonged, non-interactive stagger and the few situations where you don't get any barrels to hit back at him during the rage. Otherwise, he benefits from a very short downtime, 1 out of 3. And finally, the only proper source of lackluster telegraphing is his jump. Now, thankfully, due to his size, few players will ever attempt to get above False Knight, which does alleviate this issue to a significant degree. However, he still possesses 2 attacks that start with a jump and are therefore not properly telegraphed, and as such, I cannot give him a perfect score on this aspect. Still, 1 out of 3. Dividing those 3 points by the total number of points possible, which is 12, False Knight gets a very solid evil score of only 25%. With a few minor tweaks to his jump, stagger and barrel RNG, he could become one of the least evil bosses in the entire game. However, even in his current state, he is a very fair boss. And now, for the question we've all been waiting for. Does Moss Mother perform better or worse than False Knight on the evil scale? Well, here is her evil card. As you can see, the two look very similar, Moss Mother only losing out by a single point on vague mechanics. While they do score similarly, the faults of each boss actually differ on every individual aspect. Not unlike False Knight, Moss Mother does very well in avoiding being influenced by luck. Still, she does not entirely succeed. When crashing into the ceiling, Moss Mother causes either rocks or moss grubs to rain down. Apart from the moss grubs being significantly more of a chore to tackle, she may also summon either 1 or 2 grubs, seemingly at complete random, which, especially for newer players, will significantly impact the difficulty of the encounter. Ignoring all of this, she could also simply choose to fly right at you, which I've seen her do up to 3 times in a row. This surprised me because attacks like this are often limited to a maximum of 2 in a row. Since this attack is the least random of the 3, and given that you can quite easily attack her when she performs it, I would consider it the simplest of her attacks to respond to. With all of that said, luck doesn't control this fight to a great degree, but it does have an impact, and as such, Moss Mother scores 1 out of 3 on erratic outcomes. Now, unlike False Knight, Moss Mother does not score perfectly on vague mechanics, and the reason for this is very specific, so let me give you an example. In this clip, I'm hitting Moss Mother while she's high up in the arena. Now, because I don't have any means of quickly getting out of the way, and because her telegraph is very short, I get hit immediately after jumping up to strike her. It's possible that there's a way to always be hitting her while also staying completely safe, but in my experience, it's actually quite risky to attack the Moss Mother when she's idling. Try to notice the next time you're fighting her whether you're implicitly moving away when she's in one of the corners. If this is so, I think it's an unconsciously learned safety measure because of her lightning-fast telegraph. And that's not very intuitive in my opinion. As such, she gets a 1 out of 3 on vague mechanics. Everything else is quite well telegraphed. For inactive gameplay, I'm hesitant to dock a point just because the fight is actually quite active. However, in a few cases, it seems that you do actually have to retreat. For example, as just mentioned, when she's in the corner of the arena. You also have to be careful of attacking her when rocks fall in unfortunate places. Admittedly, those are quite minor criticisms, so it's a bit of a toss-up. I could see the argument for giving her a perfect score here, although I've chosen not to. And finally, Moss Mother gets a 1 out of 3 on lackluster telegraphing, again for a few minor reasons that come together to form a greater whole. Unlike False Knight, she does not have a unique telegraph for each of her attacks, so when she does this little animation loop, you basically have no idea what she's about to do. Secondly, as mentioned prior, her telegraph sometimes feels too short to react to if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And finally, if you're above her when she slams into the ceiling, you will likely get hit, which is an uncommon occurrence, but certainly not an impossible one. With 1 point in each category, Moss Mother ends up with a final evil score of 33%. Slightly worse than False Knight, but certainly nothing to get up in arms about. I'm usually not one to claim that two options are about equally good, however in this case, I do honestly struggle to crown a winner. In my opinion, False Knight is a great first boss, but so is Moss Mother. And interestingly, I like them both for different reasons. False Knight seems slightly more well thought out, while Moss Mother is able to benefit from years of developmental experience. So while I cannot tell you which one I think serves as the better first boss, I would love to hear what you think down below. Just remember, no Silksong spoilers. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more Hollow Knight and Silksong related content, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. I try my best not to put Silksong spoilers in my thumbnails, and any of my videos relating to Silksong will, at least for a good while, always contain a spoiler warning at the start, letting you know exactly what I'll be talking about. With all of that said, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye!